Hello and welcome to the Mind Report. I'm Jonathan Phillips from Yale University, and today I'm going to be talking with Tom Flower from the Percy FitzPatrick Institute at the University of Cape Town, who's been doing some really fascinating research with a species of bird called Drongos. So I'm going to let you start just sort of by introducing yourself and then talking a little bit about the Drongos, and I'll sort of interrupt as we go along, and hopefully it'll be fun.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, I guess I'm actually from the UK originally, but after I finished my first degree, I went out to South Africa to get some sort of field experience as studying animal behaviour. And I ended up on the Kalahari meerkat project, which is this enormous long-running field project in the middle of the Kalahari Desert in South Africa. And there I studied meerkats from around 2003 to 2007. And while studying those meerkats, there was one thing I always saw, which was this quite fascinating bird called a fork-tailed drongo. What they would do is they would approach the meerkats, which sort of forage on the ground as a loose party, and they would hang out with them and often provide sort of true alarms in response to predators, which would approach. And the meerkats would eavesdrop on these alarm calls and dash to cover, which seemed rather helpful. The drongos would often swoop down to ground to pick up food items that have been flushed by the meerkat, so kind of like a plow.
Wait, so just to make sure everyone's on the same page, so meerkats or they're sort of bigger mammals, right?
Yeah, that's right. They were. I mean, I went out to study them because I wanted to look at cooperative breeding, but they are, as you say, they're about they stand up. They're about the height of a ruler. So much bigger than a drongo, which is this sort of small black bird about the size of the palm of your hand.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so the predators that the drongos are giving alarm calls for are what sorts of predators are threatening meerkats?
Well, things like eagles, martial eagles, which is a big African eagle, but also things like jackals and wildcats. Although, brutally honest, most of those terrestrial predators have been shot in the farmland area we work in.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, the meerkats in theory were benefiting from this. It's not clear whether drongos were alarming for the sake of the meerkats. They might just be alarming for other drongos nearby. But it was what happened next that really intrigued me and sort of led to where I've now gone. And that was that in the absence of any predators, when a drongo saw a meerkat handling a big juicy food item like a scorpion or a larvae or something which it had excavated from underground, the drongo would actually make an alarm call, a false alarm. The meerkats would all dash to cover, abandon the food, and the drongo would swoop down and collect the food item. So they're getting a free lunch, basically. After I got bored of meerkats, I went on and started studying the drongos, and I've been doing that ever since 2008.
So what sorts of food are they stealing from?
Well, with meerkats, sort of the drongos don't just go for meerkats, it turned out. They go for a lot of things. And they steal different kind of foods from different animals, depending upon what that animal can search for. But with the meerkats, it's lots of larvae and scorpions and spiders, lizards, these sorts of things.
Yeah. So, So I guess you have to. There's going to be something where if they give too many false alarm calls, then it will probably won't work anymore, right? Because then the meerkats are going to start just ignoring the alarm calls.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that was one of the reasons I then thought, okay, so what's going on here? What are they doing? Why are they using deception, as it were, to steal food? And then how come deception keeps working? Because the drongo wouldn't just do it once; it would keep it going and going. And just like the boy who cried wolf in Aesop's fable, if you lie too often, deception falls apart, and your listeners ignore you, as it were. So I think just like you say, I sort of wondered what tactics they might use to evade that problem, as it were. The next kind of quirk was that the drongo didn't just use its own drongo-specific alarm to steal food. It also mimicked the alarms of meerkats and also other animals in the environment, that the meerkats also eavesdropped on. And that was quite important, because then I kind of came up with these ideas about maybe if you're able to change the deceptive signal you make, you could keep your deception racket working, as it were. Kind of like if the boy who cried wolf dressed up as one of the villagers and impersonated their voice to keep just responding. That sort of
right. Fascinating. So it's not just meerkat alarms. They also steal from other species. You said so they can mimic lots of different calls.
That's right.
And then they sort of are randomly switching between different alarm calls.
Well, that's not quite clear yet. It's not random, that's for sure. And I've got some lovely results which sort of indicate that, which I'll come on to. Yeah. So what you might see is if the drongo is stealing food from an animal, let's say a meerkat in this case, they go for about 25 different species. So meerkat's a nice one for us to stick with for now.
Yeah.
So if their false alarms stop working, then the next time they have an opportunity to steal food, the drongo is more likely to use a different alarm call. And by doing so, they actually increase the probability that they'll steal food. So it looks like they aren't just changing at random; they're specifically changing when it benefits them to change.
And so they'll try. So the thought is, maybe they even use their own alarm call sometimes, and they try it, and then the species, let's say it's a meerkat, just looks up at them and it's just like, well, I don't really see anything going on, and just keeps foraging for food or whatever. Or keeps eating the food that he has. And so then they'll actually switch to the meerkat's own alarm call once they see that that's not working.
I'll dichotomize. One tactic is that they'll change their alarm call from one opportunity to steal food to the next, and more likely to do so if they've previously failed. And then the other tactic is that they'll produce the specific alarm that's most effective for the species they're targeting. So with a meerkat, you mimic a meerkat more often. If you're with a pied babbler, which is a bird they steal food from, then you mimic the pied babbler's alarm more often. So I think that's how that works. Those are the two key tactics that I found, which would suggest that this wasn't just random alarm switching, but that the drongos were specifically selecting calls or selecting to change calls.
Fascinating. Yeah, so it seems really, really flexible. And I mean, if they're sort of realizing this, seeing more meerkats they're going to be more likely to be able to get the food if they use a meerkat alarm versus some other species like a pied babbler.
Yeah.
But then, but it definitely is true also that strategy is effective, right? That actually does increase their yield.
Yeah, no, that's right. So I think one of the key things for me in my research is that I think the background's kind of the fun thing in a sense of how you can go out and test this in the field. So in order to do that, I sort of myself and actually a lady called Amanda Ridley, who's now at University of Western Australia, she helped me start off a drongo study population of habituated drongos who were all individually recognizable. And the way we did that is we trapped them using a walk-in cage, and then we would give them color rings. And then we'd habituate these birds using food initially, and then we'd cut back on that so that they weren't looking to us for food as a resource. And that meant we could follow individual drongos around at less than 5 meters in the natural environment. And I mentioned earlier that I worked for this meerkat project. Well, the advantage of the study site where I was is that the meerkats and numerous other species are also habituated to people. So basically, you've got this unique window into the natural world in that particular location, and it's just a very lucky coincidence that it's all in one place. So then I could really follow these drongos around and watch what different individuals did from one false alarm attempt to the next, as it were, one food theft attempt to the next. And additionally, I could do some nice experiments where I could present food items to meerkats and then play back different drongo alarms to individual meerkats and show the tactics that the drongos are using are actually improving the likelihood that a meerkat will be deceived and drop its food. So for example, I would compare a mimic of a meerkat alarm with a drongo's own alarm and another mimic, and I'd show that that meerkat alarm would be more effective, as it were. As it happens, that's not the exact experiment I did. I did it with pied babblers, but that's
similar.
The gist of it. And similarly, I did a neat experiment where I was able to play a sequence of alarms to was pied babblers, and what would happen is either the last call in that sequence would change or it would remain the same. And if the call changed, then you would maintain this alarm response in the pied babblers. And if that last call changed, if that last call remained the same, then you would see a habituation effect and the pied babblers would cease responding to the false alarm. And really, what I then had to look at is, do drongos do this in real life?
Yeah.
You know, after many hours sort of slavishly wandering over the dunes and following the individual drongos, I was able to get enough data to show that, yes, sure enough, individual drongos are specifically mimicking the species alarm. They're specifically mimicking the alarms of the species they're following.
The ones they're trying to steal from.
Yep.
Yeah.
Secondly, that they are changing their alarms and are more likely to change if they previously failed in a food theft attempt. So that was bringing together these experimental data and these natural observations to sort of try and show the causality of it all.
Right. Yeah, that's really beautiful. Wait, but just sort of a background question: why do the drongos try to steal food rather than just getting their own food?
So I mean, when I set out, I'm principally an evolutionary biologist, so I was also first asking why try and steal food at all, and the reason is, in fact, that drongos are awesome flycatchers, and they'll spend all summer just sitting at the edge of a tree picking off gnats and things like that. But in the winter in the Kalahari, it gets cold, really cold, like minus 11 Celsius. Can't remember what that would be in Fahrenheit. So
cold.
So there just aren't any insects moving around, and it's at that time that they engage in this food theft behaviour. So it's basically a tactic they use to exploit animals that can dig in the ground and catch food that drongos can't get themselves. I mean, the moral of the story there is really that you engage in theft when you can't afford to find your own food. And that's what kicks off this whole behaviour, this ecological scenario.
Right. So it seems, wow. So it seems like, putting all of the sort of the different pieces together that we've been talking about, there's just a ton of flexibility in it, right? I mean, it seems like they're only using this sort of deception when they aren't able to collect their own food as much. They seem to be titrating it somewhat to like how to not be the boy who cried wolf. They also seem to be doing it specifically for the species that they're trying to steal from at any given time. And then they're also, after failing to steal once, they'll switch sort of flexibly.
That's right. And it goes on from there, little small results I've not even mentioned just now.
Yeah.
Things like they actually, in order to get food, they won't always use a false alarm, even though it's the best tactic. Sometimes they'll just fly down and bully animals, especially the smaller animals, and steal the food from them, which suggests that perhaps they're holding back false alarms. And of course, this idea that, sure enough, they can change to keep it working, but that might actually be exhausted ultimately. So it pays for them to sort of hold back their false alarms a little bit and use aggression when they can. So again, they're not just always producing false alarms. There's a bit of flexibility there. And my colleague Amanda Ridley has done some nice work showing that drongos are more likely to alarm at predators which threaten the species that they are following with that species. And that's like when they're on their own, and that's because these other little predators don't threaten the drongo themselves. So if a yellow mongoose wanders by and they're with a group of pied babblers, they'll shriek at it, But if they're on their own, they won't. Quite intriguing. Are they trying to actively increase the frequency of true alarms that they're making and try improve their deception? It is very intriguing.
Yeah. I mean, so all of it taken, you think about all that picture, and then my thought is like, well, they must be kind of like us, right? They must be thinking like, oh, I'm really going to get this sucker, right? Like, that didn't work this time, I'm going to switch to that. And and if they're doing something, obviously you want to be a little bit careful in how much anthropomorphizing you're doing, but there does seem to be a lot of reason to think that maybe what they're doing is something like trying to figure out what that other creature's beliefs are, right? And then trying to change its beliefs in a way that doesn't actually align with their world. So they're trying to give them something like a false belief, which would, and it's sort of, that whole picture is really comes from this idea of, well, the general ability that humans have to sort of understand other people's minds, which we often think of as really, really uniquely human. Maybe even a species of bird that's not much bigger than your hand, it could be doing something really similar to what we do.
I mean, yeah, that's definitely possible. We can't exclude that possibility unless you go out there and you test it. And that's actually really why this kind of behavior the drongo is doing now, it's got a name, tactical deception, has been considered quite exciting. It's also shown by chimpanzees and quite a lot of animals. And when it was first noticed in animals, people suggested this is kind of Machiavellian. They're intentionally manipulating other animals' minds, just like you say. And this is the kind of behavior which you can only accomplish if you understand other animals' minds. But the debate's kind of moved on a bit, unfortunately, because it could be that. It could be a number of other things going on too. So, for example, tactical deception is carried out by a whole host of other animals. There's even a squirrel which does it, an antelope. They produce false alarms in order to get hold of resources. And this has sort of made people wonder, okay, right, so we see animals doing a human-like behavior. It doesn't mean they do it the same way. The mechanism by which they acquire and produce that behavior might be kind of different from the one we're using. And I think what's really interesting now is to try and go out there and see what mechanism they are using. If they're using the same one as us, why have they evolved that capacity in the same way we did? And is it similar, from my perspective, is there a similar evolutionary course? And if they're not doing it the same way, why do we do it differently? Why do we need this really in a sophisticated capacity to manipulate each other's minds whilst, a Drongo can go and do it some other way?
Right. So, I mean, I guess generally, at least, on the cognitive science side, when you're thinking about theory of mind, it's taken generally to be this sort of representational system, right? So you have this representation of the other agent's mind. So, I have some representation of the world. I think things are roughly this way. And then now what I'm doing when I'm doing theory of mind is to say, well, I'm also representing what how the world is from some other person's perspective, and maybe it differs from mine in certain ways. So maybe he can't see something that I can see, or maybe he thinks that there's a banana in the box when there's really no banana in the box. But and one of the things that would give you is having this sort of representational system is it's going to be really, really flexible, right? So you're going to be able to apply it in lots of different situations. And I can apply it to any different person, and I can calculate all these really complicated things. And then so I think that's part of what makes the flexibility of what the Drongos are doing really exciting, right? Because it seems to, at least the other obvious story would be, well, they're sort of it's some learned behavior, right? They've sort of over time, they've had some association with, well, if I give this alarm call, then I'm more likely to get food, and food is good, so I get reinforcement for giving those sorts of alarm calls in this sort of situation, and so then and you build it up really sort of slowly that way. But the flexibility of what the
flexibility, isn't it? And that's what really marked the Drongos out as quite distinct from a lot of the other animals that do this. And what really begs the question: okay, how are they accomplishing that? So I wanted to look at that really and try and get into it. And so I tested the flexibility, and they were pretty flexible. Then I wanted to say, okay, so are they always really flexible? Are even the youngsters flexible? Because if they're not, then it might suggest you've got a bit of learning going on. So first of all, do they just, right from the get-go, start making false alarms to steal food from other animals? And then do they immediately have the capacity to produce these quite diverse tactics to increase the payoffs, as it were, from deception? So I've kind of actually started having a look at that, and the results aren't published. In contrast, the previous ones I've discussed kind of are, but these ones aren't. And the data collection is still coming in, but there are some nice hints there. And what I really tried to do is take a whole cohort of juvenile Drongos and follow them from the moment they left the nest and see if they could right away steal food from other animals. And a kind of strange quirk of the Drongos' biology is that these juveniles are produced in the summer months, and Drongos don't steal food in the summer months.
Oh, so you can't see them immediately.
I did focals on my juveniles and on their parent birds, in which they can coexist with in their natal territory. And I didn't observe any false alarms made by the Drongos in natural context. So it's suggesting, that it's not going on in the summer. But at the same time, I was also training these juvenile Drongos to interact with an artificial model animal, which was kind of like one of those little Dirt Devil remote-controlled cars, which I'd sort of modified, pimped that ride, as it were, and given a fluffy body and eyes, and actually a little pot on the front which could drop a food item. And, my model could then actually withdraw itself to reveal the food item that it supposedly had excavated from the ground. And then, depending upon what the Drongo did and what experiment I was running, my model could then move forward and cover the worm, thereby preventing a drongo from stealing food, or it could dash away and flee and enable the drongo to steal food. So I kind of had a sequence of little questions to say, okay, so how are drongos doing this? And the first question was, okay, so is it kind of a really hardwired behavior?
Right.
In which case we might anticipate that they would produce false alarms, but they would have very little flexibility at first. Right. Or is there perhaps a sort of, as you say, a sort of theory of mind component, potentially a capacity to understand and manipulate other animals' minds, in which case we might see that they can immediately produce false alarms to steal food, and that they can immediately adjust their behavior if the model doesn't respond to a particular alarm or otherwise. Right. And even incorporate observations of that animal's behavior and that would imply it has a certain knowledge state or is unaware of something, and exploit that information to as it were, use a false alarm and steal food. So I took the models out there and I tried to look at that. And, sure enough, about 50% of the juveniles used a false alarm to steal food from the model on the very first occasion that they were able to do so.
Yeah, so it'd be hard to, well, it's a fairly more evidence that it's this super flexible system, that it's not just some learning that's been going on, and that they're trying to. It's more evidence to that way. I mean, I don't think probably you can't rule it out. Really, what you'd want, the ideal experiment, right, is to take the drongo out of the nest, right, and then put it in a situation in which there wasn't much food around, right, and then and then see does it learn to give false alarm calls to steal food immediately.
Which is kind of what we did, though. I mean, in a sense, we took those drongos that just fledged, and then we showed them this model, and then they did produce these false alarms. Right. So then it was kind of like, oh, okay, is this hardwired, or is this, is this actually not very flexible and hardwired, pardon me, or is there sort of greater flexibility than this? They can not only produce false alarms first time, which we might predict for either of our potential mechanisms for that kickoff point. Right. Or should we sort of try and test whether this is more flexibility at an early point? Sorry, I'm losing track slightly there. So anyways, what I went and did is I then went off and I showed the drongo that the model would respond to one type of alarm and ignore another. And then I wanted to see in the next opportunity to steal food from it, would it produce the alarm calls that made it flee to cover rather than ignore? And they didn't at all, And then I did a variety of other experiments to see whether they could very quickly learn what worked with the model, and they didn't do any of it. And then I did an experiment where I gave them repeated trial and error learning, and I found that they could learn tactics that way. So it led me to believe we've got a kind of hardwired component with a bit of learning imprinted on top. But that's my perception of it.
Right. Well, of course, there's going to be some learning, right? I mean, obviously, there's going to be learning about even which calls that a meerkat makes versus a pipe outlet.
None of these mechanisms exist in isolation, as you say. They're all interlinked.
Right. The interesting question is, is there enough flexibility, and is the whole of the behavior seems like it couldn't have just been learned in the most sort of basic associative way, where you just you have one day you accidentally make a false alarm call because you think you see something and realize that someone flees, and you're able to steal the food, or whatever, right? But there's some, even if there's some component of it that really does seem to be more flexible in the way that we think it's more similar to what humans are doing. I think that would be really interesting, even if there is a learning component to it. Yeah,
so I think it's about trying to think, okay, so even if that's not what a juvenile drongo is not doing, that doesn't mean that the way that they accomplish behavior doesn't change as they approach adulthood. The kind of flexibility I was seeing out of adult drongos was quite impressive. They would apparently seem to switch very rapidly compared to the juveniles. And I did some experiments with them, and I can't really go into the details of it because nothing's conclusive. And in fact, the previous results I just mentioned are far from conclusive. But certainly, once you get to these adult drongos, they start to be able to rapidly switch tactics, high flexibility depending upon the context they're in. And there'd be things like, are they actively concealing themselves when making false alarms to, further disguise the fact that there's a drongo making a false alarm? And, sure enough, adults are always quite a long distance from the animal they're stealing food from, which is more likely to simulate the kind of conditions they make true alarms in, right? So again, is this learning, or are they actually responding and considering the way in which the target animal will be interpreting the signal they're producing and how they'll be assessing its true and false value? Would that make sense, would you say? Or
yeah, so you're right. So the thought is that when you get to see these, by the time you get to these adult drongos, the flexibility at which they're doing it, I mean, even the fact that they're like, say that they're trying to almost conceal themselves when they're giving in these false alarm calls and things like that, that all of that, it does, I mean, am I right in thinking that your thought is, well, at this point, there does seem to be some portion of it that has to be built in. I mean, not every species is learning to do all this stuff in just sort of boring, associative ways, but that there is a lot of learning that goes along, and that's why you see adults doing this, and not juveniles, or you see that the adults, learning things more, be able to pick up things more rapidly, or whatever. Once that structure is sort of built, and then you can really use it and flexibly adapt it in lots of ways. Is that the sort of the picture of it?
I think it is. I think we just, within animals, certainly we don't know enough about how the development results in sort of a fully fledged cognitive capacity, as it were. It's got a sort of rudimentary way of explaining it. But yeah, certainly I think that if you have all that learned basis, I think you phrased it quite nicely. You're saying, does something change? Does something about the understanding about how these sort of I'm going to stop there because I think I'll move into a track where I'm not quite sure if I can back up what I'm saying, as it were. But certainly, if you have acquired a behaviour one way, that doesn't mean that you continue to do it that way. You can now switch the mechanism by which you're able to produce that behaviour. So I think that I'm not ruling out this possibility that there's theory of mind or a mental manipulation going on with the drongos. I just think there's accumulating a body of evidence that suggests that it's not necessary to assume that kind of ability in order to explain their behaviour. It can definitely be produced by other mechanisms in isolation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously what's amazing about the studies you've been able to do is that you're able to show really what they're doing in really nice studies, even though they're sort of out in the wild, right? I mean, you could do so much more controlled experiments if you just brought the drongo in from birth, right, and brought it into the lab, and you could completely control every piece of evidence that it gets about the world and which things work which ways and whatever, and then you could probably get a better. And maybe in some ways it'd be artificial, but you could do a really different sort of experiment, which might tell you exactly what sorts of learning are going on and how that's working.
I mean, that's right. I mean, the reason I study animals in the wild, other than because I like walking around Africa,
doesn't sound bad.
But the reason is because my questions are related to the function of these behaviours in the environment. So why have they evolved, really? If I was asking why or how do they achieve these behaviours, I could very happily move these birds into a lab and sort of really go at that specific question, restrict all their experience, make it an unnatural context perhaps, but not so much so that the behaviour doesn't kind of develop approximately as it would do normally. And then by controlling the experience, like you say, you can start to really pin down what's going on. And that could be very easily done with drongos, So, and not just drongos, I think there are a lot of other birds that produce these kinds of behaviours. Corvids in general have been fruitful for research on the kind of more sophisticated cognition in animals, as it were. So, it's definitely an open option for the future.
Yeah. So, sort of going back to the bigger question about how all of this relates to human theory of mind. So for I'm sure you know this, but I'll give a little bit of background. So that, for a long time, the thought was that human theory of mind sort of develops pretty late, right? So you see, so kids the youngest kids won't really even understand theory of mind. They don't get it. And then once they get older, then so about 3 or 4, the thought was, well, that's when theory of mind developed. And the way that the studies worked that sort of, initially motivated this view was that they had this test called the false belief test, right? So it was, you had one person that, say, she put her marble in a box, and then she left the room, and then another person went and moved her marble from the box to another location. And then the person came back in the room, and then the kids were asked, where do you think that she'll look for the box? Or where do you think she'll look for the marble? Is she going to look for the marble where she previously placed the marble, or is she going to look for the marble where the marble actually is? And the youngest kids, so 2 and 3-year-olds, would actually say she'll go to where the marble actually is. She won't have this sort of they seem to not be attributing her the false belief that her marble would still be in the location that she last left it in, because she didn't have evidence that it moved. So initially everybody was thinking, well, it's this really complicated thing. It must be it work in this particular way where it has a lot to do with sort of this explicit representation of false beliefs, but then recently there's been a huge shift, because there's been all of these studies with infants showing that in some cases it seems like infants are really able to understand false beliefs or theory of mind in general. So some work by René Baillargeon and a lot of other people now has suggested that with infants you obviously can't ask them you can't ask like an 8-month-old where is this person going to look for the marble, but you can you can do sort of looking time studies to see how surprised they are. So the studies worked in a similar way, but basically the upshot was that the infants would be more surprised if someone didn't see the ball switch locations. They'd be more surprised when someone reached for it in the place where the ball actually was than when they reached for it where the place where they last left the ball. And that suggests that the infants in some sort of way had this sort of representation of the person believing that the ball was in the location that it no longer was. They had a representation of a false belief. So, but what seems really weird about the theory of mind literature is that most of the things that you find that really small infants are able to do, which in some cases are really impressive, so they're able to do things like calculate numbers in some sort of basic way, or they seem to have sort of an innate understanding of physics in some way. And then you find that those exact systems, the sort of number representation or the sort of intuitive physics representations, that those worked really similar in other non-human species, right? So you can see it oftentimes in primates. Sometimes you can find it in dogs and things like that. Mm-hmm. But then theory of mind seems to be this one where it seems like there is evidence that human infants are doing it. I mean, there's at least a good body of evidence suggesting that's going to be the right answer. I don't think it's totally decided. But then when you get to these other species, it just seems like it just totally falls apart. Right. So, and then I think false belief is sort of the accepted test of that. So it would be really cool if you could find a way to do the false belief test with the Drongos, because they keep trying to do it with even, with sort of really sophisticated non-human primates, and they just keep not being able to show that they can, attribute a false belief to anyone. They can get something like ignorance, so they can get that maybe you can't see a particular thing or you don't understand a particular part of the world, but they really can't get that you have a false belief about it. As far as you can tell. But if you could show that Drongos could do, because if even a Drongo could do it.
The funny thing with the Drongo is that they're actually creating the false belief they're creating a false narrative, as it were. Right. The mechanism, again, unknown. So it's a bit difficult because you're not almost testing for them recognizing a false belief in another. You might, in a sense, be testing for whether the Drongo can recognize when it can't create a false narrative. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If you were going to try and use their normal paradigm of their behavior to try and investigate this, then you'd have to say, okay, they don't bother using a false alarm if they know that their own false alarm can be falsifiable, as it were.
Right.
Does that make sense to you? Or?
Yeah, so the thought is that, it's going to be a feature of sort of, so the thought is, it's going to be a feature of theory of mind that you would understand that, when someone will actually be able to have a false belief and when they won't, right? Mm-hmm. And that you should really only try to, give these, if you understand that what you're giving these other agents is false beliefs, then you should really only give it to them when you think they're actually going to pick up on the false belief, or they're going to sort of accept so for instance, if you said, if there was, maybe one sort of prediction of this would be something like, if the meerkat's just busily burying in the ground or whatever, you're more likely to make a false alarm call when they aren't looking up for the eagles that are flying over, than when they're sitting there staring at the sky or whatever.
Yeah. So that's very easy to test. Natural observations, again. I think that when people approach these from different disciplines, they come up with different questions. And I've obviously been out in the field thinking about these different questions, and although I watch a lot of animal behavior, you become slightly narrow-minded in what you're looking for, especially the longer you're with them, funny enough. The guest always brings the sharpest knife, as they say. So it's quite likely that I could go back out essentially equipped with a different way of approaching the question. and see the behavior in a very different way. So I'll have that opportunity to do that, certainly. And that's something that's very easy to test, is the exact point at which false alarms are produced relative to the target individual's behavior. And see if, that's essentially maximizing the likelihood that the alarm will be successful in making them dash to cover. So yeah, that'd be easy to do. So yeah, if they have been spotted by a meerkat, for example, the meerkat looks at them, they don't bother making a false alarm. They fly off, they wait, then they make a false alarm. That sort of thing. Again, similar paradigm would be easy to do. And I think that would, again, I mean, unfortunately, as far as I'm concerned, I don't think you could ever conclusively say this shows that they are attributing mental states. It's not like a false belief test, because there's still a potential for learning. And that's always the slight pain, as it were. So again, we go back to these juveniles, and why they're so useful is because they've lacked that experience of using false alarms. They've not had that opportunity before, and they're not getting it in the natural environment. They don't need to use it. So we've just got those models. But then, of course, it's quite hard to say how attentive they are to a model, and how they can attribute false beliefs to a model, as it were.
Right. So, yeah. I mean, even in the studies with older children, I mean, we never think about this explanation with adults or with studies with humans or whatever, or we typically don't. But there probably is a ton of learning that goes into children being able to pass the sort of explicit false belief test, where they have to predict where someone's going to look for their marble or whatever. And I mean, so I think your picture, I think it's really plausible that your picture for what's going on with the Drongos could actually be somewhat similar to what goes on with humans. Right, that there's both this sort of innate structure that allows us to represent other people's minds, and that there's a lot of learning that goes into us getting us sort of up to speed. And much like the adult Drongos, adult humans are really, really flexible in what we're able to do with that.
So do we have any evidence in humans that we have a sort of post hoc attribution of a mental state, when we've observed something and gone, okay, they must have therefore had such and such belief to have arrived at that kind of behavioural conclusion for them, and then we can essentially develop, as it were, a rich theory of mind through that. Is there any evidence of people that occurs?
Well, I mean, as adult, I mean, just I actually, studies aren't coming to mind on that. I'm sure there have been. This thing is so well studied, but I'm sure there are some studies that, in fact, do that. I think they're. No, I'm not remembering the details of the one I was thinking of.
I flipped it on you quite harshly there.
No, but I mean, obviously, as humans, as adults, we do in fact do that all the time, right? You see someone doing something that you wouldn't have predicted they would have done, and then now you want to make sense of their behavior, right? So we do all this calculation of, well, what mental state could they have that would make them do that sort of thing.
For sure. I mean, you almost do epistemic action, where you intentionally do something wrong just to see and confirm a prediction that it is going to be wrong. It's very, if animals are doing that sort of thing, or humans, it becomes very difficult to ascertain whether they're failing or if they're actually doing something successful in order to improve their future performance. Those sorts of things, it becomes quite difficult to understand what exactly is going on, but I think it's quite fascinating. And personally, I think there's quite a lot of evidence for epistemic action in animals, albeit it hasn't been framed in that context. That would be a great. Yeah. Another avenue that I think would be really helpful here would be to try and figure out ways of seeing the extent to which one Drongo understands that other Drongos are giving a false alarm call, right? So that if they, I mean, it's even some more like higher order, more flexible system at that point, right? So if the Drongos happen to be in the same area, and that they look around and see there's no predator that's going to attack a meerkat, and this Drongo is giving a false alarm call, now they get it, like they get that this person is trying to give that person a false belief, right? And if they're able to get all of that, it just seems that in some ways it's so similar to what humans are doing. Even if the story of acquiring it ends up being a little bit different, there's something that's really deeply interesting about the similarity between those two and the flexibility there. Indeed. Well, I'll have to get going and really try and. I mean, there's a wealth of options. I think a lot of it, the way I work, is I do think about a top-down sort of theoretical question, and then I go into the field and I just look around and see what's going on. Right. And then you can tell what's going to work, what isn't going to work necessarily. At least something to work that's worth testing. You never know the results are going to come out, and I've probably got about 10 times more failed experiments than I do successful ones. But that's kind of the nice thing. You think so, as you say, at what point do they produce false alarms relative to the behaviour of their intended target? Simple point which I can go and examine and maybe try and test that. And again, going to look at the drongos themselves is going to be a tough one because there's all kinds of annoying little variables in the field which you can't control. So other drongos are always perched up high, so they're always very well informed about the available the presence of predators. So if you say, they're less likely to respond to drongo alarms than targeted species, just say, well, they're just less at risk, so they don't need to respond so much. And that's why really I think pulling these things into the aviary is the way to go.
Yeah. And just to give you even more reason to just really continue studying this, I mean, I think what the deeply interesting thing is that I think a lot of your research with humans suggests that, well, maybe one of the things that really makes us special as humans is our ability to do theory of mind, right? I mean, and that's just, it's not an uncommon view. It's really all over the place. But to the extent that we can really deeply sort of study what humans are doing and how that system works, and then find something really similar in other species, then I think it opens up new possibilities for what is it that makes humans special, and what is it that differentiates us from these, and where are the limits between all of this?
It's sort of, for me, it's a funny thing because it's almost like the age-old Cartesian debates of how are animals different from humans, which is in my opinion kind of meaningless because we're all animals basically. Humans can undertake space flight. There's a nice distinction between us and the other animals.
They don't do abstract.
Is it just going to be a question of degree, or is it going to be a really point difference in what we can accomplish? And I mean, over the last 20, 30 years, as I've sort of matured in my career, I've noticed that more and more of these boundaries have just been knocked down, as it were, between what we can accomplish in terms of our cognition and what other animals can accomplish. Nevertheless, there are obviously distinct differences, and that's a huge point of debate. Which I'm certainly not going to chuck my oar in on where I think it should be. But what I think is quite intriguing is really understanding why we have or why we need those particular abilities. So why do we benefit by being able to manipulate each other's minds, or just more nicely put, to understand others' beliefs? You're much more eloquent in describing this, but suffice to say that as an evolutionary biologist, I want to know what caused us to obtain that capacity. Why did we need it in order to accomplish what we do as humans, and what does it enable us to do? And you think about some things like cumulative culture. So our culture, culture builds upon itself, as it were, and other animals can't do that. There's some lovely stuff being undertaken right now. Actually, I say lovely. It's comparative studies with children with autism, of course, examining what they can accomplish, and they don't obviously have a full theory of mind, a rich theory of mind, and therefore what is it that they are unable to achieve, which other people can who have developed a full theory of mind. And I think it's very intriguing. It will tell us a lot about what distinguishes us, if that is something that we only do, and if we don't only do it, then what these other animals are using it for, why have they evolved it? So it comes back, I think, to what I was saying at the beginning that got me into this and made me interested in it.
Right. Yeah. No, I like this one. I think, I think what the case with autism as well, it's what's interesting is that it's true that they fail a lot of the theory of mind tests that have been developed, or at least they don't get them to a later age. But also, one of the things that's come out of it, and just sort of more support for your general framework that you've been thinking about the Drongos with, is that, if you actually get them to pay more attention to social cues, or you provide them with social situations in which there's less anxiety or they're more able to be engaged, then they're actually much, much better in performing at these theory of mind tests. So one of the things about people with autism is that they don't often look at people's eyes, right? They just really don't make contact with people's eyes. They tend to look more at their mouths. But your eyes are a great source of information for what your beliefs are going to be, right? So you might think that part of what's going on there is that they just haven't done as much learning as people without, or children without autism have done. So you could have this sort of picture where, well, there's some sort of structure there, and then there's a lot of learning that goes on, and then the end result is sort of this combination of both things.
Oh, that's fascinating. Okay, that's very intriguing. Okay, I mean that's intriguing on one level because people talk about animals They talk about them as expert intentionality readers. Expert in using all the sort of cues that we produce in our body language in order to read intentions without actually understanding mental states. Are you sort of suggesting there that really just by virtue of not responding to social cues in the same way as other children do, if you have autism, you just aren't going to have that capacity to acquire and learn the necessary information to develop a full theory of mind quite so quickly? Is that sort of the rationale?
You could have that view, or you could even have the more specific view that just the reason they aren't performing well in specific theory of mind tasks, like in one single task, is because they don't have as much information as other children have when they're performing that single task. So maybe one possibility is they're actually not that bad at theory of mind, right? So they don't have the right information to be able.
That's fascinating. It's very, very intriguing. Gosh.
Yeah.
Food for thought on that front.
Yeah, no, but all of this is just to suggest that it's an excellent topic, and I think your studies have, I want all of the people in cognitive science to be paying more and more attention to these sorts of studies you're doing. I think they're totally fascinating and deeply important for our understanding of the mind.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm very glad you do. It's very nice to link the two disciplines and really try and pull them together and learn from each other. And I certainly take a lot from the input I get from your side, and that's greatly appreciated.
Good. Well, thanks for being willing to talk about it today.
Cheers. It's been a pleasure.
It's been fun. Okay.
Bye-bye now.
All right, take care.